Hey there, and welcome to True Scary Stories. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. That helps YouTube know you love creepy stories, and it'll keep sending more your way. Story 1. The Knife in the Dark. My name is Dylan, and these events happened nearly 14 years ago, but they still wake me up screaming in the middle of the night. I was 16 in grade 10, my final year of high school. What should have been a celebration of freedom became a descent into hell. I have epilepsy and autism, conditions that marked me as different in the worst possible way. By grade 10, my classmates had transformed into something inhuman. The sweet children I once knew in grades 7 through 9 had been replaced by cruel strangers with dead eyes and twisted smiles. The bullying started slowly, like poison seeping through water. Students would mouth vile words at me when teachers weren't looking, their faces contorting with hatred I couldn't understand. When I fought back with curses and threats, their cruelty only intensified. They fed on my anger, like vampires feeding on blood. The boys had become feral beasts, their humanity stripped away by some invisible corruption. The girls were even worse. Their laughter had turned into something that belonged in a horror movie, high-pitched and maniacal. They would whisper secrets that sounded like death threats, their eyes gleaming with malicious joy. Even the teachers seemed infected by the darkness that had consumed our school. Their faces were hollow, their voices strained, as if they were fighting against some unseen force that was slowly driving them insane. I could feel different tensions crackling through the air like electricity before a storm. During one assembly in the foyer, Mr. Stevenson, who we called Steve-O, stood before us like a man possessed. The large circular space, with its 4 comfortable couches, had become a battleground where students gathered to plot against each other. Steve-O's first words to the boys were delivered in a voice that shook with barely controlled fury. I couldn't remember exactly what he said, but his eyes burned with the kind of rage that comes from watching children turn into monsters. Then something snapped inside him. His face turned purple with rage as he screamed at the girls. "And girls, all this bitchiness, it stops now." His voice echoed off the walls like the roar of a demon, and I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing hysterically. The sound that came from his throat wasn't entirely human anymore. Only about 5% of our grade remained untouched by the spreading madness, and even we could feel it trying to claw its way into our minds. I had 2 friends who stayed loyal to me through everything, but I watched them change little by little, their smiles becoming forced, their laughter hollow. My 3rd friend hung out with a group I despised, students whose eyes had gone completely black with whatever evil was consuming our school. I often wished I could escape to a different timeline, one where these particular students didn't exist, where the halls weren't filled with the smell of fear and hatred. The other grades seemed normal, which made our corruption even more terrifying. So we were the chosen ones, marked for something horrible. That day started like any other nightmare. I sat through boring lessons while my classmates whispered threats and plotted cruelties. The classroom was divided into territories like a war zone, each group of friends claiming their piece of hell. 7 boys sat at the far end, and one of them had become my daily tormentor. Every day we engaged in verbal warfare that felt like it might turn physical at any moment. His smile promised violence, and I knew one day he would try to destroy me completely. 4 girls sat at the front, twins and their friends, who somehow remained pure in this corrupted place. They were the only ones who still said hello with genuine kindness, their voices like angels in a world full of demons. When I looked at them, I remembered what normal humans were supposed to be like. 3 other girls sat together in the middle, their whispers carrying poison through the air. 3 boys huddled near them, their faces already showing signs of the madness that was spreading. 2 students from different cultures spoke in their native language, but even their foreign words sounded contaminated by whatever evil lived in our school. Then there was me, sitting alone on a bench seat against the wall, my disabilities making me both target and survivor. I kept to myself because I could feel the corruption trying to seep into my mind through contact with others. Our classroom had both bench seats and desks scattered throughout, and students could sit wherever they chose. This freedom had become a curse, as friend groups formed like gangs preparing for war. Mr. Innes was our teacher for those final 2 years, and while he seemed decent, I could see the strain in his eyes. He was fighting the same battle we all were, trying to stay human in a place that demanded we become monsters. Second period had barely begun when the PA system crackled to life with its haunting ding-dang-dong. The sound had become associated with terror in my mind, a bell that tolled for approaching doom. I tried to ignore the principal's voice as usual, but then I heard words that made my blood freeze. Code Black. What the hell was he talking about? I scoffed, but fear was already crawling up my spine like ice-cold fingers. When he said lock all doors, every nerve in my body screamed danger. I glanced at the code sheet by the whiteboard and saw the words that would haunt me forever. Code Black. Lockdown. The principal's voice was too calm, too casual for what was happening. He spoke like a man reading his own death sentence with a smile. This wasn't normal. This was the voice of someone who had given up fighting whatever evil had taken over our school. Mr. Innes moved with mechanical precision, locking the door and covering the glass window with paper that looked like a burial shroud. The sound of curtains closing was like coffin lids slamming shut. Through the walls, I could hear other teachers running through the foyer, their footsteps echoing like the hoofbeats of the apocalypse as they sealed us into our tomb. Our school's layout suddenly felt like a trap. 4 separate grade blocks with 5 classrooms each, all opening into the massive round foyer, with its 4 couches that now seemed like furniture in a morgue. The 2 doors at either end, that usually led to freedom, had become barriers keeping death out, or keeping us in. The school died around us. Complete, absolute silence fell like a heavy blanket, suffocating and wrong. Our classroom became black as a grave, and though I could make out some faces in the darkness, they looked like ghosts floating in the void. Nobody looked scared, which was the most terrifying thing of all. We all seemed bored, as if we had been expecting this moment of horror our entire lives. I realized this wasn't a drill. In our peaceful state with its 600,000 people, nothing like this had ever happened. We only knew fire drills, not lockdowns. This was something new and evil, something that had chosen our cursed school as its hunting ground. We sat in the consuming darkness, our minds filling with nightmarish possibilities. The air became thick and poisonous, so quiet that even a pin dropping would sound like thunder. I wasn't naturally scared of anything, but this silence was different. It was the silence of a predator waiting to strike. I strained my ears for sounds of forced entry, for screams, for anything that would tell me what monster was stalking us. The questions hammered at my brain, like nails being driven into my skull. Was it already inside the school? Were we safe, or were we about to become victims? Was it something that killed, or something worse? Would we be attacked, or would it toy with us first like a cat with mice? The longer we waited in that tomb-like darkness, the more reality began to bend around us. Fear wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was a living thing crawling through the room, touching each of us with invisible claws. I became convinced we would be attacked, and the savage fighter that lived deep inside me began to wake up. I had never let anyone see that violent part of myself, saving it for emergencies. This felt like the ultimate emergency. The boys at the far end started whispering, their voices like insects buzzing in a corpse. The sound broke my concentration as I tried to listen for approaching footsteps or breaking glass. I sat rigid on my bench seat, back pressed against the wall, forcing myself to appear calm while my mind prepared for war. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began scanning the room, every few minutes, studying the faces of my classmates. The boys had fallen silent, which was somehow more terrifying than their whispers. Silence meant they were listening too, waiting for death to find us. The other students sat frozen at their desks like statues in a graveyard. But the four girls at the front were the most disturbing sight of all. These girls who normally giggled and laughed like hyenas, who squealed during tickle fights and filled every day with noise, sat silent as corpses. Their usual joy had been sucked out of them, leaving behind empty shells that barely seemed to breathe. The classroom felt like it belonged to another dimension, a place where happiness and laughter had never existed. Where were the mouthy fights and giggling that usually filled our days? The absence of normal life made everything feel like we were already dead, just waiting for our bodies to realize it. Minutes stretched into hours in that hellish darkness. I found myself muttering curses under my breath, begging for this nightmare to end, for us to return to the familiar hell of normal school life. At least that hell had rules we understood. When the all clear finally came, it felt like resurrection from the dead. But the truth was more horrifying than anything we had imagined. A student from our own grade, someone we saw every day, someone who walked among us, had held the principal at knife point. One of us had become a monster. The laughter that followed was the worst sound I had ever heard. We were laughing at our own near-death experience, celebrating the fact that a killer had walked among us. The student was expelled immediately, but the damage was done. We all knew now that any one of us could snap and become something unspeakable. Story 2. The Hunter at the Gates. Nearly at the end of my final year, with only a month left of high school hell, I thought the worst was behind me. I was counting down the days until I could escape that cursed place forever. But evil wasn't finished with us yet. The day began with the usual torture of boring classes and hostile stares. I watched the clock like a condemned man waiting for execution, begging for lunch to arrive so I could breathe freely for a few minutes. Then came the sound that had haunted my dreams for months. Ding dang dong. The principal's voice drifted through the speakers with that same unnatural calm that had terrified us during the knife incident. When he mentioned Code Gray, my heart began racing with a mixture of terror and sick excitement. Lock the foyer doors and keep working until further notice, Mr. Innes explained with barely concealed fear that someone untrustworthy was prowling around our school. The word untrustworthy was clearly a lie meant to keep us from panicking. I could see the truth in his eyes. Something dangerous was hunting us. My excitement felt wrong and twisted, but I couldn't stop it. Part of me wanted to face whatever monster was circling our school, like a shark around a sinking ship. The savage fighter inside me was awake again, hungry for battle. I tried to focus on my work, but my hands shook with anticipation. Every shadow outside seemed to move with predatory intent. Every sound could be footsteps of something inhuman approaching our windows. By lunchtime, we were still trapped in our own school, prisoners waiting for our captor to decide our fate. The tension in the foyer was suffocating as students gathered at the windows like witnesses at an execution. I pushed through the crowd and pressed my face against the glass, desperate to see what nightmare was unfolding outside. What I saw made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. 2 security guards stood facing a dark figure whose back was turned toward us. Even from a distance, this person radiated an aura of wrongness that made my skin crawl. They stood too still, their posture too perfect, like a predator that had learned to mimic human behavior. The conversation between the guards and this shadow figure grew more heated with each passing second. I could see the guards' body language changing from professional to desperate. They were afraid, truly deeply afraid, of whoever they were facing. I found myself silently screaming for something to happen. The twisted part of my mind wanted to see violence, wanted to watch this mysterious figure unleash whatever evil they carried inside them. The other students pressed against the windows beside me, their faces flushed with the same sick excitement, all of us hungry for horror. But after an agonizing minute, the figure simply walked away, followed by the security guards like shepherds guiding a wolf away from sheep. Our collective curse echoed through the foyer as we realized we had been denied our glimpse into true darkness. Mr. Innes later claimed someone was just having a bad day, but his lie tasted bitter in the air. We all knew we had encountered something far more sinister than a person with problems. The truth came to me years later in college, in a place where I had finally found peace among other students with disabilities. My teacher aides had helped me mature and control the savage impulses that lived inside me. One of them in particular had saved my soul with her caring discipline, though beneath her sweet smile lurked an iron will that terrified even me. On a bus ride home, a girl from my old high school sat beside me. I recognized her from grade 7, though she had vanished after that year like a ghost. When I mentioned the lockdowns as a funny memory, her response chilled me to the bone. She had been the dark figure outside our school that day. She told me why she had returned to that place of torment, but her reasons were so disturbing that they cannot be repeated. Her smile as she told the story wasn't human anymore. It was the smile of something that had been broken and rebuilt wrong. I realized then that our school hadn't just been a place of education. It had been a factory for creating monsters. Some of us, like me, had barely escaped with our humanity intact. Others, like her, had been transformed into something else entirely, drawn back to the source of their corruption, like moths to a flame. Those lockdowns weren't funny memories. They were warnings of the darkness that lived inside people, waiting for the right moment to break free and hunt. Story 3. The Graduation Nightmare. This is the story I've never told anyone, not even my closest friends. It happened during our graduation ceremony. The day we were supposed to celebrate our escape from high school hell. Instead, it became the most terrifying experience of my entire life. The ceremony was held in the main gymnasium, a cavernous space that echoed every whisper and footstep. Hundreds of family members packed the bleachers while we graduates sat in neat rows on the gym floor, wearing our caps and gowns like funeral shrouds. I should have been happy. After years of torment, bullying, and lockdowns, I was finally free. But something felt wrong from the moment I walked into that gym. The air was thick with an oppressive energy that made my skin crawl. Other students seemed to feel it too. Conversations were muted, smiles forced, and everyone kept glancing around nervously, as if expecting something terrible to happen. Principal Stevenson took the podium to begin the ceremony, but his usual commanding presence was gone. His hands shook as he gripped the microphone, and his voice cracked when he tried to welcome everyone. Behind him on the stage sat our teachers, but they looked like prisoners awaiting execution rather than educators celebrating their students' success. Mr. Innes caught my eye from the stage and gave me what should have been an encouraging nod, but his face was pale as death. Something had terrified these adults, and they were trying desperately to hide it from us and our families. The ceremony proceeded normally at first. Names were called, students walked across the stage, families applauded, but I noticed that some graduates never made it to their seats after receiving their diplomas. They would shake hands with Stevenson, pose for the photo, then simply vanish into thin air. At first I thought they were just leaving early to meet their families. But as more names were called, and more students disappeared, a horrible realization crept over me. These weren't early departures, these were disappearances. I started counting. Sarah Mitchell's gone after her photo. James Torres shook hands and evaporated. Emma Walsh smiled for the camera and ceased to exist. With each missing student, the gymnasium seemed to grow larger and more echo-filled, as if reality itself was stretching to accommodate the growing emptiness. The families in the bleachers didn't seem to notice. They continued clapping and cheering for children who were no longer there, taking photos of empty spaces where their loved ones should have been standing. It was as if a selective blindness had fallen over everyone except the remaining graduates. When my row was called to line up, I found myself standing behind Marcus Chen, the student who had caused our first lockdown with the knife incident. He had been expelled immediately after that day, so how was he here for graduation? His skin was gray as ash, and when he turned to look at me, his eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire eye from corner to corner. "Dylan," he whispered, his voice like wind through a graveyard. "Do you remember what I did that day?" I couldn't speak. This thing wearing Marcus's face smiled, revealing teeth that were too sharp and too many for any human mouth. "I never left," he continued. "None of us really leave. We just wait in the spaces between moments, in the silence between heartbeats. And now it's time for everyone to join us." The line began moving toward the stage, and I realized with growing horror that I was trapped in a procession toward my own disappearance. Each step felt like walking deeper into quicksand. The stage loomed ahead, like an altar for human sacrifice. Students in front of me reached the principal, shook his hand, and dissolved into nothingness. But now I could see what was really happening. Stevenson wasn't shaking their hands. He was pulling something out of them, something bright and essential that screamed as it was torn away. The thing that looked like our principal was feeding on our souls, and our families were watching it happen while cheering. When my turn came, I found myself face to face with the creature wearing Stevenson's skin. Up close, I could see that his flesh was rotting, held together by some unnatural force. His breath smelled like decomposing flowers and forgotten screams. "Dylan Thompson," he announced to the crowd, but his voice was the sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh. "Graduate of the damned." He reached for my hand, and I saw that his fingers ended in claws that dripped with the essence of stolen lives. This was how it ended, not with violence or escape, but with a handshake that would erase me from existence while my family applauded my destruction. But something unexpected happened. The savage fighter that lived inside me, the one I had kept hidden for so long, suddenly exploded to the surface. Instead of taking his hand, I grabbed his wrist and squeezed with inhuman strength. The creature's eyes widened in surprise and something that might have been fear. For the first time, the predator had encountered prey that could fight back. My grip tightened until I heard bones cracking, and black ichor began seeping from between my fingers. "Not today," I growled, my voice carrying the same inhuman quality that had infected everyone else. The thing wearing Stevenson's face began to shriek, a sound like metal being torn apart. The gymnasium erupted in chaos as the illusion shattered. Families in the bleachers suddenly saw what was really happening. Their children being devoured by monsters wearing the faces of trusted adults. But it was too late for most of them. The disappeared students were gone forever, consumed by whatever evil had taken root in our school years ago. Only a handful of us escaped that day, those who had somehow retained enough humanity to fight back against the corruption. I ran from that gymnasium and never looked back. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I really escaped, or if I'm still sitting in that dark classroom during our first lockdown, imagining everything that came after. The line between nightmare and reality blurred so completely in that place that I may never know for sure. But I do know this: Narcos School was more than just a building where children learned. It was a feeding ground for something ancient and hungry, something that transforms innocent children into willing victims. And somewhere out there, other schools are experiencing their first lockdowns, their first taste of the horror that waits in the spaces between safety and chaos. The only graduates who truly escaped were those who learned to fight monsters by becoming something monstrous themselves. We carry that darkness with us forever, a reminder that sometimes the only way to survive evil is to embrace the evil within ourselves. Story 4. The Fire Drill That Never Ended. My name is Jake, and I was 17 when this happened, at Westfield High. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of crisp autumn day that should have been beautiful, but felt cursed from the moment I walked through those school doors. Our chemistry class was on the third floor of the science building, a place that always smelled like sulfur and death, even on normal days. Mrs. Henderson was demonstrating some boring experiment with acids when the fire alarm began its piercing wail. The sound cut through the air like a scream, but instead of the usual short bursts we were used to, this alarm kept going and going, rising and falling like the cry of something dying. "Fire drill, everyone," Mrs. Henderson announced, but her voice shook in a way I had never heard before. Her hands trembled as she turned off the burner, and I noticed she kept glancing toward the windows with the look of someone who had seen something she shouldn't have. We filed out into the hallway, joining the stream of students evacuating the building, but something was wrong with this drill. The teachers weren't following their usual calm procedures. Instead, they moved with barely contained panic, constantly checking their watches and whispering urgently to each other. As we reached the stairwell, I smelled something that made my stomach turn. It wasn't the clean scent of a controlled fire drill. It was the thick, choking smell of real smoke mixed with something else, something that smelled like burning meat. The stairwell was packed with students from all 3 floors, but instead of the usual chatter and complaints about interrupted classes, everyone was silent. The only sounds were footsteps echoing off concrete walls and the occasional whimper from younger students who seemed to sense the wrongness in the air. Halfway down the stairs, the student in front of me suddenly stopped. Through the small window in the stairwell, we could see the courtyard where we were supposed to gather for the drill, but instead of empty space waiting for evacuating students, we saw something that defied explanation. The courtyard was filled with students, but they weren't moving. Hundreds of teenagers stood in perfect rows, their faces turned upward toward our building, their mouths hanging open in silent screams. Their eyes reflected the orange glow of flames, but there was no fire visible anywhere. "Keep moving," a teacher hissed from behind us, but her voice was raw with terror. "Don't look outside, just keep moving." But we couldn't stop looking. As we descended floor by floor, more windows revealed the same horrifying scene. The motionless students in the courtyard seemed to be growing in number, though no one was joining them from our stairwell. They appeared to be materializing from nowhere, their school uniforms from different eras, some wearing clothes from decades past. When we finally reached the ground floor, the exit doors stood wide open, revealing the courtyard in full view. The sight nearly broke my mind. Thousands of students now filled the space, all frozen in that same position of silent screaming. But the most terrifying part was that I recognized some of them. There was Tommy Rodriguez, who had died in a car accident 3 years ago, Lisa Park, who had committed suicide during my freshman year, David Kim, who had simply vanished one day and was never found. They stood among the motionless crowd, their dead eyes fixed on our building, as if waiting for something. The teachers began pushing us toward the exits, but none of the students wanted to go outside. We instinctively knew that crossing the threshold meant joining that frozen army of the dead. Some kids started crying, others began backing away from the doors, but the teachers kept shoving us forward with inhuman strength. "You have to go outside for the drill," Mrs. Henderson screamed, but her face had changed. Her skin was stretched too tight across her skull, and her smile revealed teeth that had grown into fangs. Everyone must participate in the drill. I realized then that our teachers had been replaced by something else, something that was herding us toward whatever fate awaited in that courtyard. The fire alarm continued its endless wailing, but now I understood it wasn't warning us about fires. It was the dinner bell for something that fed on young souls. Students began panicking, pushing back against the teachers, but more faculty members appeared from nowhere to block our retreat. They moved with coordinated precision, like predators who had done this many times before. Their eyes had the same black emptiness I had seen in Marcus during that graduation nightmare. I managed to break away from the crowd and ran back toward the stairwell. Behind me, I could hear the screams of my classmates as they were forced outside to join the silent army. The sound of their terror mixed with inhuman laughter from the creatures wearing our teachers' faces. I climbed back up the stairs, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. Through each window I passed, I could see more students appearing in the courtyard, fresh additions to the collection. Some I recognized from my own classes, their faces now frozen in that same expression of eternal horror. I made it to the roof access and burst through the emergency exit. From 3 stories up, the full scope of the nightmare was visible. The courtyard contained not hundreds but thousands of students from across decades, all arranged in perfect geometric patterns like some massive ritual circle. At the center stood a figure in a principal's suit, but it was impossibly tall and thin, its arms reaching out like a conductor directing an orchestra of the damned. The fire alarm had stopped, replaced by a sound even worse, the collective intake of breath from thousands of frozen students, as if they were all trying to scream at once, but couldn't make any sound. The sight drove several students who had followed me to the roof completely insane. I stayed on that roof until real firefighters arrived hours later. They found the school completely empty, except for us few survivors on the roof. There was no fire, no emergency, and no record of a drill being scheduled. When they searched the courtyard, it was empty concrete with no sign that anyone had ever been there. But I know what I saw, and sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that fire alarm in my dreams, calling me back to finish the drill I never completed. Story 5. The Substitute Teacher. I'm Maria, and this happened during my senior year at Riverside Academy. We had a substitute teacher that day, who should never have been allowed near children. Our regular English teacher, Miss Walsh, had called in sick that morning. She was young and kind, the type of teacher who actually cared about her students. When the substitute walked into our classroom, everything changed. He introduced himself as Mr. Blackwood, but something about his name felt wrong, like it belonged to someone who had been dead for a very long time. He was tall and gaunt, with skin so pale it was almost translucent. His eyes were the worst part. They seemed to look through you rather than at you, as if he could see parts of your soul that should remain hidden. Today we're going to study a very special poem, he announced in a voice that sounded like whispers in an empty house. He wrote on the whiteboard with movements that were too fluid, too precise, like someone who had practiced the same motions for centuries. The poem he wrote wasn't in any of our textbooks. The words seemed to crawl across the board like living insects, and reading them made my vision blur and my head pound. Other students began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, rubbing their temples as if the words were causing them physical pain. Who would like to read the first stanza aloud? Mr. Blackwood asked, his smile revealing teeth that were too white and too sharp. Nobody volunteered. We all instinctively knew that speaking those words would be dangerous, though we couldn't explain why. The substitute's smile widened until it split his face in ways that human skin shouldn't stretch. I'll choose then, he said, pointing a finger that seemed longer than any human finger should be. You, in the third row. He was pointing at Jennifer Mills, a quiet girl who always sat alone and never caused trouble. She shook her head frantically, but her mouth opened against her will and began speaking the words from the board. As she read, her voice changed, becoming deeper and more hollow with each line. The temperature in the room began dropping rapidly. Our breath became visible in the sudden cold, and frost started forming on the windows, despite the warm October day outside. Other students wrapped their arms around themselves, but I noticed that Mr. Blackwood seemed completely unaffected by the freezing air. Jennifer continued reading, but now her voice wasn't her own anymore. It was the voice of something ancient and hungry, something that had been waiting for someone to speak its words aloud. Her eyes rolled back until only the whites showed, and dark veins began appearing under her pale skin like ink spreading through water. "Stop," whispered Amy Chen from the front row, but her voice came out as barely a breath. Mr. Blackwood turned his impossible smile toward Amy. "But we're just getting started," he said, and his voice now carried harmonics that human vocal cords couldn't produce. "Poetry is meant to be shared, to change those who hear it." Jennifer finished the first stanza and began the second, but now other students were starting to change too. Those sitting closest to her developed the same dark veins under their skin. Their eyes began reflecting light like animals in the dark, and when they breathed out, their breath came in clouds that smelled like decay. I realized that the poem was some kind of infection, spreading from student to student through sound and proximity. Mr. Blackwood wasn't just a substitute teacher, he was something else entirely, using our classroom as a laboratory for transforming children into whatever he served. I tried to stand up and run, but found my muscles wouldn't obey. The poem had paralyzed everyone except Jennifer, who continued reading with that horrible, inhuman voice. We were trapped in our seats, forced to watch and listen as our classmates were systematically corrupted. By the time Jennifer reached the third stanza, half the class had been transformed. Their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and they moved with jerky, unnatural motions like marionettes controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. When they looked at the unchanged students, hunger gleamed in their altered eyes. "Beautiful," Mr. Blackwood whispered, running his two long fingers through Jennifer's hair as she read. "You're all becoming so much more than you were." The transformed students began turning toward those of us who were still human. I could see in their faces that they were no longer our classmates. They had become something that wore familiar faces, but felt nothing but appetite for what we represented. Just as Jennifer began the final stanza, the classroom door burst open. Miss Walsh stood in the doorway, but she wasn't sick as we had been told. She was covered in what looked like salt, and carried a leather bag that emanated a strange protective energy. "Get away from my students," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that made even Mr. Blackwood step back. The substitute teacher's face began changing, his human mask slipping away to reveal something underneath that had too many teeth and eyes in places where eyes shouldn't be. "You're too late," he hissed. "The reading is almost complete." Miss Walsh began chanting in a language I didn't recognize while throwing handfuls of salt around the room. Where the salt landed, the transformed students screamed and clutched their heads. Jennifer's voice faltered as she fought to regain control of her own mouth. The battle between our real teacher and the creature lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours. Salt burned through the air like acid. The temperature swung wildly between freezing and blazing hot, and reality itself seemed to bend around their conflict. Finally, Mr. Blackwood let out a shriek that shattered every window in the classroom and vanished in a cloud of sulfurous smoke. The transformed students collapsed, their skin slowly returning to normal as whatever had possessed them fled with their master. Miss Walsh helped us to our feet, but made us promise never to speak of what had happened. She explained that some knowledge was too dangerous to share, that there were things in the world that hunted specifically in schools because young minds were more susceptible to certain types of corruption. We never saw Mr. Blackwood again, but sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, moving from school to school with his deadly poetry, looking for the next classroom full of victims to transform into his servants. Jennifer recovered physically, but she never spoke in class again, and sometimes, late at night, I still hear echoes of that inhuman voice, reading words that should never have been written. Story 6. The School Nurse's Secret. In Alex, and I was 15. when I discovered what really happened in the nurse's office at Millbrook High. What started as a simple visit for a headache became a journey into a nightmare that still follows me today. It was a dreary November morning when the migraine hit me like a sledgehammer during second period math. The pain was so intense that Mrs. Rodriguez immediately wrote me a pass to see the school nurse. I should have known something was wrong when she handed me the pass with shaking hands and whispered, "Be careful down there." The nurse's office was located in the basement of the main building, down a long corridor that always felt colder than the rest of the school. As I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being absorbed by the walls themselves. Nurse Patricia was new this year, replacing old Mrs. Murphy, who had worked at the school for 30 years before suddenly retiring without explanation. Patricia was young and beautiful, with perfect white teeth and eyes that seemed to glow with their own inner light. All the students loved her because she was so understanding and always made you feel better. But as I approached her office that day, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Through the partially open door, I could hear voices, multiple voices coming from what should have been a single-room office. They were speaking in whispers, but the tone was wrong. It sounded like people discussing a meal they were about to share. I crept closer and peered through the crack in the door. What I saw inside defied everything I thought I knew about reality. The nurse's office had been transformed into something that belonged in a medieval torture chamber. The familiar examination table was still there, but it was covered in dark stains that definitely weren't from normal medical procedures. Shelves that should have held bandages and medicine instead displayed glass jars filled with floating objects that looked disturbingly organic. But the most horrifying sight was Nurse Patricia herself. She stood with her back to the door, but her reflection in the metal cabinet showed a face that wasn't human. Her beautiful features had melted away to reveal something with too many eyes and a mouth that split her head nearly in half. Around her stood 3 other figures in white coats, but they moved wrong, their limbs bending at angles that would have broken human bones. On the examination table lay someone I recognized, Tommy Fletcher, a sophomore who had come to the nurse's office the day before complaining of stomach pain. But Tommy wasn't moving, and the dark stains around him suggested he never would again. This one was particularly nutritious. One of the white-coated figures said in a voice like grinding metal, "Young fear has such a distinctive flavor." Nurse Patricia turned slightly, and I caught a glimpse of her true profile. Where her nose should have been, there was only a gaping hole that seemed to extend infinitely into darkness. "We'll need another one soon," she replied. "The hunger is growing stronger." I tried to back away quietly, but my foot caught on something and I stumbled. The sound echoed through the hallway like a gunshot. Instantly, all conversation in the nurse's office stopped. "We have a visitor," Nurse Patricia said, and her voice now carried undertones that made my teeth ache. I ran faster than I had ever run in my life, my footsteps pounding against the linoleum floor, as inhuman shrieks erupted from the office behind me. The hallway seemed to stretch longer with each step, as if the building itself was trying to trap me in its digestive system. Behind me, I could hear things that weren't quite footsteps pursuing me. They sounded like claws scraping against stone, accompanied by a wet sliding noise that suggested bodies moving in ways that defied anatomy. The fluorescent lights began flickering and failing as whatever was chasing me passed beneath them. I reached the stairwell and took the steps 3 at a time, my lungs burning as I climbed toward the safety of the upper floors. But when I looked back, I saw them coming up after me. Nurse Patricia led the pack, but she was no longer bothering to maintain her human disguise. She scuttled up the walls like a spider, her white coat billowing behind her like wings. I burst through the stairwell door into the main hallway, screaming for help. Students and teachers turned to stare at me, but their expressions weren't concerned. They were annoyed, as if I was interrupting something important. "The nurse," I gasped, pointing back toward the stairwell. "She's not human. She killed Tommy Fletcher." But when I turned to show them the pursuing monsters, the stairwell was empty. Nurse Patricia appeared at the other end of the hallway, walking calmly with a concerned expression on her perfectly human face. "Alex," she called sweetly, "you left before I could help you with your headache. Please come back to my office." Everyone stared at me like I was insane. Mrs. Rodriguez frowned and asked what was wrong with me. Other students whispered that I was having some kind of breakdown, but I knew what I had seen, and I knew that going back to that office meant joining Tommy Fletcher and whatever hell he had discovered. "I'm fine now," I lied, backing away from Nurse Patricia's approaching form. "The headache is gone." Her smile never wavered, but for just a moment, I saw her true face flicker beneath the human mask. "Are you sure?" she asked. "I have something special that will make you feel so much better." I ran to the principal's office and demanded they call my parents to pick me up. I claimed to be violently ill, and something in my terror must have convinced them because they let me leave immediately. That afternoon, I learned that Tommy Fletcher had been found dead in his bedroom, apparently from a sudden heart attack. The official cause was listed as a rare condition that sometimes affected teenagers. His parents were devastated, but they accepted the medical explanation because what else could they do? I tried to tell my parents what had really happened, but they thought I was having stress-related hallucinations. They scheduled appointments with counselors and doctors, all of whom assured them that teenage minds sometimes create elaborate fantasies to cope with trauma. But I wasn't imagining things. Over the next few weeks, I watched as more students visited the nurse's office and then died mysteriously at home within days. Each death was explained away with medical terminology that sounded official but felt hollow. The worst part was watching Nurse Patricia continue her work. She maintained her perfect human disguise during the day, earning praise from parents and administrators for her caring nature. Students continued visiting her office with minor complaints, never knowing they were walking into a spider's web. I started warning other students, but they thought I was crazy. Some even reported my harassment of the beloved nurse to the administration. I was forced to attend counseling sessions where therapists tried to convince me that my experiences weren't real. But I knew better. I had seen behind the mask, glimpsed the feeding ground that masqueraded as a place of healing, and I knew that somewhere in the basement of our school, in jars on hidden shelves, pieces of my classmates were being preserved like trophies. I graduated early and transferred to a different school for my final semester. But even now, years later, I check the obituaries from my old town. Young people still die there at an unusually high rate from mysterious medical conditions. And I know that Nurse Patricia is still working, still feeding, still wearing the face of compassion while harvesting the lives of trusting children. The most terrifying part is that she's probably not alone. How many schools have similar predators hiding in positions of trust? How many nurses, counselors, and administrators are really something else entirely, waiting patiently for the next vulnerable student to walk through their door? I never got treatment for my headache that day, but the pain was nothing compared to the agony of carrying this knowledge alone. Story 7. The Library After Hours. My name is Sarah, and I was 16 when I discovered what really happens in Eastside High's library after the final bell rings. I was a bookworm who spent most of my free time reading in the quiet corners, but I never stayed past closing time. I should have kept it that way. It was a Thursday in late February when I lost track of time while researching a paper on medieval literature. The library was my sanctuary from the chaos of high school social life. Mrs. Chen, our librarian, was always kind to students who genuinely loved books, and she often let me stay a few minutes past the official closing time. That day, however, I became so absorbed in a particularly fascinating text about ancient rituals that I didn't notice the sun setting outside the tall windows. When I finally looked up, the library was dark, except for the small reading lamp at my table. The silence was different from the usual quiet of a library. It was the silence of a place where no living thing should be. I gathered my books and headed toward the exit, but found the main doors locked from the outside. The heavy metal handles wouldn't budge, no matter how hard I pulled. Panic began creeping up my throat as I realized I was trapped in the building. I called out for Mrs. Chen, but my voice seemed to be swallowed by the darkness. The library felt much larger than it had during the day, with shadows stretching between the tall bookshelves like corridors leading to nowhere. Emergency lighting cast eerie red glows that made the familiar space look like a scene from hell. As I searched for another exit, I began hearing sounds that didn't belong in an empty building. Footsteps echoed from the upper level, but they were too heavy and too slow to be human. Books began sliding off shelves in distant sections, hitting the floor with sounds like falling bodies. I found a phone near the librarian's desk and tried calling for help, but the line was dead. Worse, when I set the receiver down, I could hear breathing coming from the earpiece, slow, deliberate breathing that suggested something was listening on the other end. The footsteps from upstairs were getting closer, accompanied now by a dragging sound as if someone was pulling something heavy across the floor. I hid behind the circulation desk, my heart pounding so loud I was sure whatever was up there could hear it. Through the darkness, I saw a figure descending the main staircase. At first glance it looked like Mrs. Chen, but something was horribly wrong with her proportions. She was too tall, her arms hanging too low, and her head tilted at an angle that would have broken a human neck. "Sarah," she called in a voice that was almost but not quite Mrs. Chen's. "I know you're still here. Come out, dear. I have something wonderful to show you." I pressed myself deeper into the shadows behind the desk. This thing might look like my beloved librarian, but the way it moved and spoke revealed its true nature. It glided between the bookshelves rather than walking, its feet never quite touching the ground. "The library has so many secrets," the Mrs. Chen thing continued, her voice getting closer. "Books that were never meant to be read by living eyes. Stories that change those who read them. Would you like to see them?" As she spoke, the books around me began opening themselves, their pages fluttering without any wind. The words on the pages were moving, rearranging themselves into new patterns that hurt to look at. I squeezed my eyes shut, but I could still see the twisted text burning against my eyelids. "The knowledge you seek is here," the creature whispered, now so close I could smell the scent of old paper and something rotting. "All the answers to questions you didn't know you had. All the truths that drive people mad." I opened my eyes and saw her standing directly in front of my hiding place. Up close, her face was a patchwork of different features, as if she had been assembled from pieces of various people. Her smile revealed rows of teeth that belonged in the mouth of a shark. "Mrs. Chen," I whispered, hoping against hope that some part of my real librarian was still trapped inside this monstrosity. "Mrs. Chen is reading now," the creature replied, tilting its head with bird-like curiosity. "She's reading the most important book of all lies, the one that teaches you how to stop being human. Would you like to read it too?" The thing reached for me with fingers that had too many joints, but I rolled away and ran deeper into the library. Behind me, inhuman laughter echoed off the walls as the pursuit began. I ran through sections I had never seen before, past shelves that seemed to extend infinitely upward into darkness. The books on these shelves were bound in materials that didn't look like leather, and they whispered secrets as I passed. Some of the volumes were chained shut, but their chains were rusted and breaking. The creature that wore Mrs. Chen's face followed me through the maze of knowledge, sometimes walking on the floor, sometimes crawling along the walls and ceiling like a spider. Her voice called out helpful library tips that had become twisted into threats. "Remember to use the card catalog for older materials," she sang sweetly while her claws scraped against wood. The reference section has answers to questions about death and what comes after. I found myself in a section I had never seen before, where the books seemed to be alive. They pulsed like beating hearts and occasionally opened themselves to reveal pages that bled real blood. The air here was thick with the smell of copper and ink. One book fell open in front of me, its pages showing pictures that moved like windows into other worlds. I saw students from other schools, other times all trapped in libraries just like this one. They were reading from books that consumed them word by word, page by page, until nothing remained but empty clothes and echoing screams. "Found you," the Mrs. Chen thing whispered from right behind me. I spun around to find her standing impossibly close, her face now a swirling mass of features that couldn't decide what to be. In her hands was a book bound in what looked like human skin, its pages yellow with age, and stained with substances I didn't want to identify. "This is the book that turned your librarian into me," she explained with genuine enthusiasm. "And now it's your turn to read. Don't worry, it only hurts until you forget what pain feels like." She opened the book, and the pages began glowing with sickly light. Words started pouring off the pages like living things, flowing toward me with hungry intent. I could feel them trying to crawl into my ears, my nose, my mouth, seeking to rewrite my thoughts from the inside. Just as the words reached me, the library's fire alarm began blaring. Real firefighters burst through the main doors with axes and emergency lights. The creature shrieked and dissolved into smoke that smelled like burning books, taking her impossible library sections with her. I was found huddled in the normal reference section, clutching a regular encyclopedia, and babbling about moving words and spider librarians. The official report stated that I had suffered a panic attack after accidentally getting locked in during after-hours cleaning. But I know what I experienced, and I know that somewhere in that library, hidden behind shelves that only appear after dark, Mrs. Chen is still reading the book that stole her humanity. She's reading it over and over, each word making her less human and more hungry for the next student who stays too late. I never set foot in another library after that, because I learned that knowledge isn't always power. Sometimes knowledge is a predator that devours those who seek it, leaving behind only empty shelves that hunger for fresh minds to consume. Story 8. The Field Trip to Nowhere. I'm Marcus, and I was 17 during my final year at Northwood High when our history class took a field trip that none of us should have survived. What was supposed to be an educational visit to a historical site became a journey into a nightmare that still haunts the few of us who made it back. Mr. Davidson had been planning this trip to the old Whitmore Asylum for months. The abandoned mental hospital had been closed since the 1970s after a series of unexplained deaths, but it was considered historically significant. Our assignment was to document the conditions that mental health patients faced in earlier decades. The bus ride there should have been our first warning. Our usually cheerful driver, Mr. Peterson, was pale and sweating despite the cool October weather. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror as if something was following us, and twice he asked Mr. Davidson if we really had to go to that place. "It's just an old building," Mr. Davidson assured him, but even our confident teacher seemed nervous. He kept checking his watch and muttering under his breath about getting there and back before dark. The asylum appeared through the morning fog like something from a horror movie. 3 stories of red brick and broken windows surrounded by dead trees that looked like skeletal hands reaching toward the gray sky. The building seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a zone of unnatural darkness around its perimeter. As we filed off the bus, the temperature dropped noticeably. Our breath became visible in the sudden cold, and several students shivered despite wearing warm jackets. The silence around the building was complete. No birds, no insects, no wind. Even the sound of our voices seemed muffled, as if the asylum was swallowing our words. "Stay together," Mr. Davidson instructed, but his voice lacked its usual authority. "Don't wander off alone, and don't touch anything inside." The main entrance stood wide open, its heavy wooden doors hanging off rusted hinges. Beyond the threshold lay darkness so complete, it seemed solid. Our flashlights barely penetrated the gloom, their beams seeming to bend and twist as they encountered whatever lurked in the abandoned corridors. The lobby was a monument to decay. Peeling paint hung from walls like diseased skin, and the floor was covered with debris from decades of neglect. But underneath the dust and rubble, I could see darker stains that suggested the building's history was more violent than our textbooks indicated. We split into groups to explore different sections of the asylum. I was with 5 other students: Jenny Walsh, David Kim, Lisa Park, Bryan Foster, and Michelle Torres. Mr. Davidson gave each group a different floor to document, and we drew the second floor. The staircase groaned under our weight as we climbed, each step releasing clouds of dust that tasted like despair. The banister was sticky with something that definitely wasn't age, and our flashlight beams revealed handprints pressed into the wood, handprints that were too small to belong to adult patients. The second floor hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that hung open like mouths screaming into the darkness. Patient rooms branched off the main corridor, each one containing remnants of lives that had ended badly. Rusted bed frames, torn restraints, and walls covered with scratches that formed patterns too deliberate to be random. "This is so cool," Bryan whispered, but his excitement felt forced. We were all trying to maintain normal teenage bravado, while terror crept up our spines like ice water. Jenny found a patient logbook that had somehow survived the decades. As she read names aloud, her voice began changing, becoming flatter and more mechanical with each entry. Patient 47, Mary Whitman, age 16, admitted for hysteria. Treatment: electroshock, lobotomy, experimental procedures. "Stop reading that," David said, but Jenny continued as if she couldn't hear him. Patient 48, Timothy Ross, age 15, admitted for behavioral problems. Treatment: isolation, sensory deprivation, surgical intervention. Her voice was now completely emotionless, like she was reading a grocery list instead of records of tortured children. Lisa grabbed the book away from Jenny, but the damage was done. Jenny stood motionless, staring at nothing, her eyes reflecting our flashlight beams like mirrors. When we called her name, she didn't respond. She had become a living statue, present in body but absent in every way that mattered. That's when we heard them, Mitted's voices drifting from deeper in the building, children's voices, singing lullabies in harmony. The sound was beautiful and terrifying, drawing us forward against our better judgment. We followed the singing through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves when we weren't looking directly at them. The voices led us to what had once been the asylum's common room. Inside we found the source of the singing, and our minds nearly shattered from the sight. Dozens of children sat in neat rows, all wearing hospital gowns from different decades. They ranged in age from about 10 to 18, and they sang their lullabies while staring at nothing, with eyes that had been surgically removed. Empty sockets wept black tears that stained their pale cheeks. But the most horrifying realization was that these weren't the ghosts of former patients. These were missing students from schools across the region, children who had vanished during field trips and educational visits over the past 50 years. They had been kept here, transformed into something between living and dead, forced to sing for the entertainment of whatever ran this place. At the front of the room stood a figure in a doctor's coat, conducting the chorus with movements that were too fluid for human joints. When he turned to face us, we saw that he had no face at all, just smooth skin where features should have been. "Welcome to our music class," he said without moving the mouth he didn't have. "We've been waiting for new students to join our eternal lesson." The singing stopped abruptly, and all the eyeless children turned toward us with perfect synchronization. They began standing up, moving with the jerky motions of marionettes, reaching out with fingers that had been filed down to points. We ran through corridors that shifted and changed around us, past rooms that contained horrors we couldn't process. Behind us, the children sang a new song, one about hunting and catching, and never letting go. David was the first to disappear. He was running beside me one moment, then suddenly he was gone, as if the asylum had simply swallowed him whole. His screams echoed from somewhere far away, growing fainter until they merged with the children's eternal chorus. Lisa vanished next, pulled into a patient room by hands that emerged from the shadows. Michelle and Bryan made it to the stairwell before something that looked like doctors, but moved like spiders, dragged them back into the darkness. I reached the main entrance alone, only to find that the doors were now sealed shut. Through the windows, I could see our bus driving away, Mr. Davidson in the passenger seat, with an expression of relief on his face. They had left us here deliberately, knowing what would happen. I spent 3 days trapped in that asylum, hiding in rooms during the day, and moving only at night, when the singing children slept. I survived by avoiding the corridors where the faceless doctors roamed, and by never looking directly at the books in the asylum's library, which contained patient records that drove readers insane. On the 3rd day, I found a window in the basement that had been broken from the inside. Glass shards were scattered on the ground outside, mixed with what looked like fingernails and teeth. I squeezed through the opening, cutting myself on the jagged edges, but the pain was nothing compared to the relief of escaping that place. When I made it back to town, I discovered that our entire class had been reported as missing during the field trip. Search teams had combed the asylum, but found no trace of us. According to official records, 17 students and 1 teacher had simply vanished without explanation. But I knew better. I had seen my classmates joining the eternal chorus, their eyes removed and their voices added to the collection of singing children. Mr. Davidson had delivered us there like cattle to slaughter, payment for some bargain he had made with the things that ruled that cursed place. I tried to tell authorities what had really happened, but they dismissed my story as trauma-induced hallucinations. I was given counseling and medication, told that survivor's guilt was making me create false memories to cope with losing my friends. Years later, I learned that field trips to the Whitmore Asylum happen regularly at different schools throughout the region. Teachers receive mysterious phone calls offering free educational visits, and administrators eager to provide unique experiences for their students rarely ask questions about the details. The asylum continues to collect its quota of young voices, maintaining its choir of the damned, while wearing the mask of historical education. And somewhere in those dark corridors, my former classmates still sing their lullabies, waiting for the next busload of students to join their eternal performance. I never told anyone that sometimes, late at night, I can still hear their voices carried on the wind. David's tenor, Lisa's soprano, Michelle's alto, Bryan's bass, all blending together in harmonies that no human throat should be able to produce. They're calling to me, inviting me to return and complete the lesson I escaped. But I know that if I ever go back, if I ever give in to the temptation to rejoin my friends, my voice will become part of that ghostly chorus forever, and the next group of students who visit will hear me singing along with all the others who thought they were just taking an innocent field trip to learn about history. The Whitmore Asylum is still there, still accepting visitors, still hungry for young voices to add to its collection. And teachers like Mr. Davidson continue making their deals with darkness, trading their students' lives for whatever rewards the monsters offer in return. Sometimes I wonder if the field trip ever really ended, or if I'm still trapped in that asylum, dreaming of escape, while my voice slowly joins the eternal chorus of the damned.